Hi everyone! Last time that we were at the Parker inheritance, Candace was having a pretty serious talk with her dad, and they were waiting to go to the bank to find out if they could find James Parker's money with the key that they found in the memorial room. And that's where I'm going to start up again. Her father released her hand. I think it would be good for you to talk with Dr. Patton again when you get back home. You know, two of the teachers at school are gay, and a lot of my favorite authors are gay. Like the guy who wrote the book about the raccoons? Her father tilted his head. I didn't know that. Yeah, it's not that big of a deal. Well, it is at work. The construction business is light years behind the rest of society. So are Milo and his friends, Candace wanted to say. Can you quit? She asked. A discussion for another time. He picked up the chicken on his plate. You're taking this a lot better than I thought you would. Any other questions? She shrugged, then asked, Did you always know that you were gay? Maybe. I'm still trying to figure that out. But I always loved your mother, just not in the way that she needed to be loved. And I always wanted a perfect daughter, and I now know that I have one. Candace took a deep breath. It was like the citrus from his hands and the lavender from Grandma's walls were mixing together. At least in her head they were. The past and the present, all jumbled up. In some ways, her father was like Reggie Bradley. He got everything he wanted, but at a horrible price. He had to hide his real self. She had been at her father's office enough to hear some of the crude jokes. How did it feel to listen to things like that every day, knowing the people you worked with thought horrible things about who you really were? Her father stood up from the table. What about Brandon? Do you still think that he might be gay? I don't know for sure, but I don't think that it really matters, Candace said. Her father winked. That's my girl. Chapter 49. They had all agreed to meet at Brandon's house before heading to the bank. All the adults, including Miss McMillan, wore work clothes, jackets and slacks and blouses. Her mother had even put on lipstick, which she hardly ever wore. Tori was dressed in all black. Candace assumed she'd just gotten home from her job at the store. Candace wore a sundress. She had wanted to wear her comfy jeans, but both her parents had vetoed that. Clearly, they were still united on some fronts. Leaving the adults in the kitchen, Candace went to look for Brandon. She didn't have to travel far. She found him in the living room, reading one of the Dork Diaries books. His tie was crooked. He slid over as Candace sat down next to him on the sofa. Too much noise in there, he said. How can you read at a time like this? He shrugged. That's a good book. She looked at the stairs as they creaked. Mr. Gibbs entered the living room. Unlike everyone else, he wore his usual get-up, t-shirt, suspenders, and slacks. Candace glanced at Brandon. His gaze remained glued to the book. After acknowledging Candace with a nod, Mr. Gibbs sat down and snatched the remote from the coffee table. With his free hand, he pulled the lever on the recliner, leaning backwards. He powered on the TV and turned up the volume, way louder than it needed to be. Brandon stared at the same page in his book for another couple of minutes. His grandfather switched to a sports channel, then turned up the volume again. Brandon's mother popped her head into the room. Why is that TV so... Oh, hey, Daddy. Sure you don't want to come with us? Glancing at Brandon, he shook his head. Don't want to go where I'm not appreciated. Brandon's mother closed her eyes. I'm surrounded by children, she muttered. Brandon, Candace, we're about to go. Candace heard her parents talking to Miss McMillan in the driveway. They must have used the back door. Brandon placed his book on the coffee table. Then he and Candace rose from the couch. As Brandon moved towards the front door, Mr. Gibbs picked up the book. A few pages later, he huffed and tossed it back on the table. His sneer was audible all the way across the room. Candace waited for Brandon to walk out first. Be there in a second, she said. I just forgot something. Once the door clicked shut, she leveled her gaze on Mr. Gibbs. I want you to know that there's nothing wrong with Brandon. Her voice was shaking, but she didn't care. She had to say this. Brandon was her partner. She had his back. He's the best thing that happened to me this summer, one of my best friends. And he is what is good and right with this city, with the world. He's perfect just the way he is. Mr. Gibbs stared at her for a few seconds, like he wasn't quite sure what he was supposed to say back, almost like he didn't recognize her. But that was good, Candace figured. He shouldn't recognize her. She wasn't the girl that she had been when they first met. It's hard out there for kids, Mr. Gibbs finally said. Boys, specifically black boys. Brandon's got to be tough. He can't just... He's perfect, Candace repeated. As she spoke, she wished that Milo and his mother and Mr. Rittenhauer and William Maynard and everyone else who had ever said anything mean to Brandon were sitting there. But they weren't. So his grandfather would have to do. Back in my day, children didn't talk back to their elders. Maybe not, she said. She looked directly at him then. She wanted to be sure he got the message. But I'm right about Brandon. I hope one day you can see that too. She had calmed down a little by the time she got back to her dad's truck. She opened the back door and was surprised to see Brandon sitting there. Is it okay if we ride together? He asked. Sure. She climbed in, and her father pulled out of the driveway. The others followed in Tori's Honda. What were you doing back in the house? Brandon asked after a few minutes. It sounded like you were yelling. It was nothing, don't worry, Candace said. Just doing my job, partner. Brandon arched an eyebrow at her, but let it go. As they reached downtown, they passed a police car driving in the opposite direction. Candace glanced behind her. Tori drove with both hands locked on the steering wheel, her eyes straight ahead. Candace knew Parker's money probably couldn't do anything to help with Tori's fears, but she wished it could. Only a couple of cars sat in the parking lot when they arrived at the bank. Everything looked dark inside. Before they could knock, Miss Sawyer and the manager appeared behind the glass door. She unlocked it and ushered the group in. You've multiplied, she said. These are our parents, Candace said. We filled them in on everything that's happening. Well, that was wise, a woman said, walking toward the group. Her hair sat in a bun on top of her head. My name is Tiffany Holliday, and you must be Candace. Candace shook her hand. It was warm, which Candace kind of liked. After everyone else introduced themselves, Miss Holliday turned back to Candace. Now for the business at hand. May I see the key? She asked, opening up her purse. Candace pulled it from her pocket and handed it to the woman. She slipped on a pair of glasses and inspected the key. There are only 2 keys in existence that open Mr. Parker's safety deposit box. One has been in my possession for 10 years. I never knew where the other one was located. That is, until yesterday. She returned the key back to Candace's palm. I have to admit, I didn't think I would ever see this day. I was sure the letter had been lost, or the city had decided to treat them like a hoax. The city leaders knew about it, Brandon said. The editor of the newspaper, too. None of them are brave enough to act on it. No one except for Candace's grandmother. Tiffany Holliday checked her watch. I've already called the press. They'll be here in 30 minutes. They want to know your story, Mr. Parker's story, too, and the city's. Candace's father stepped forward. Well, we didn't sign up for a media circus, Miss Holliday. But she did. She said nothing, nodding towards Candace. It was in the letter, Brandon said. The city has to admit how the Washingtons were driven out of town. If you want to gain Mr. Parker's inheritance, you will have to do the same, Miss Holliday said. You'll have to be a part of telling their history. Candace looked at Brandon. It's an important story, she said. It deserves to be told. Not just his story, Siobhan and Leanne and Big Dub's as well. She rubbed her bracelet. And my grandmother's too, she thought. Miss Holliday smiled. Well, it seems you have done your homework. I know some of Mr. Parker's true background. Perhaps we know enough between the 2 of us to piece it all together. She squeezed Candace's shoulder. He would have been proud. I think he found a worthy heir. Do you know if he's still alive? Brandon asked. I'd like to believe he's out there somewhere, enjoying another chance as Reginald Bradley. Tiffany Holliday opened her purse again and pulled out a small key. Candace, are you ready? Candace took Brandon's hand, then nodded. Good. Miss Holliday turned to the bank manager. It's time to collect Mr. Parker's inheritance. And that's where I'm going to stop for today. I believe we only have 2 chapters left, and we will finish those in the next video.